In 1939, if you had asked almost any military analyst in Europe which country posed the least immediate threat to the balance of power, the United States would have been near the bottom of the list. On paper, the numbers were almost embarrassing. The entire United States Army possessed just 329 tanks. Many of them were outdated models designed in the early 1930s. Some could barely keep up with trucks on rough terrain. In comparison, when Germany launched the invasion of Poland, it rolled forward with roughly 2,500 tanks in coordinated armored formations that stunned the world. The American Army itself was small enough that many European generals barely considered it relevant. In 1939, the United States ranked around 19th in global military strength. Countries like Portugal and the Netherlands had comparable or larger active armies. The total number of active U.S. soldiers was roughly 174,000. That was smaller than the police forces of some European states. For comparison, Adolf Hitler had already mobilized millions of troops and had built one of the most modern mechanized forces in history. Even more striking was the way American soldiers trained. Many recruits drilled with wooden rifles. It sounds like a myth, but it was a real problem. The Army simply did not have enough real rifles to equip every training unit. In some camps, soldiers practiced maneuvers using broomsticks or carved wooden replicas of the standard service rifle. Officers understood how bad it looked, but the United States had spent 2 decades avoiding major military investment. After the trauma of the First World War, much of the American public believed large armies were dangerous and unnecessary. Inside Germany, these details were not just noted, they were mocked. Nazi leadership believed they had found proof that the United States was a declining society, incapable of serious war. Hitler himself dismissed the country in private conversations with his generals. He described America as a weak, divided nation. In one infamous remark, he called it a decayed country, claiming it was too politically divided and culturally mixed to mobilize effectively for a long conflict. But the skepticism about American power was not based only on ideology. German military intelligence had real numbers to support their conclusions. The United States possessed a tiny standing army. Its tank force was almost non-existent. Its air force was smaller than those of several European powers. Even American generals admitted the problem. One U.S. officer later recalled that if the country had been forced into a major war in 1939, it would have faced enormous difficulty equipping even a single modern armored division. At the same time, Germany was demonstrating something completely new in warfare. Blitzkrieg tactics combined tanks, aircraft, artillery, and fast-moving infantry into a single coordinated strike. When German forces moved into Poland, they did not simply advance slowly across the border. They shattered defensive lines, surrounded armies, and cut off entire regions in days. The speed shocked military observers around the world. To many of them, it looked like the future of war had arrived, and America was nowhere near prepared for it. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States was still trying to stay out of the conflict entirely. The political mood was dominated by isolationism. Many Americans believed European wars were tragic but distant problems. Congress passed neutrality laws designed specifically to prevent the country from being pulled into another global conflict. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the growing danger in Europe, but he also knew that the public had little appetite for rearmament. Factories that would later produce tanks and bombers were still manufacturing refrigerators, washing machines, and automobiles. Shipyards were building commercial cargo vessels instead of warships. Aircraft factories produced relatively small numbers of planes each year. The industrial base existed, but it was not yet organized for war production. From the German perspective, the United States looked like a sleeping giant that had chosen to stay asleep, and there were reasons to believe it would remain that way. The Atlantic Ocean created a massive natural barrier. Germany was fighting in Europe. Japan was expanding in Asia. The idea that millions of American soldiers might one day cross oceans to fight on multiple continents seemed unrealistic to many German planners in the late 1930s. German propaganda reinforced these assumptions. Newspapers and radio broadcasts described the United States as soft, decadent, and politically chaotic. Nazi ideology emphasized the idea that racial and cultural diversity weakened nations. Because the United States was a country of immigrants with many ethnic groups, Nazi theorists argued that it lacked the unity necessary for sustained war. Even some neutral observers shared parts of this view. The American Army had not fought a large-scale modern war since 1918. Its equipment was outdated. Its officer corps had limited experience commanding massive mechanized formations. Compared with the battle-hardened German Wehrmacht, which had spent years secretly rebuilding and modernizing, the U.S. military looked like an amateur organization. Yet beneath the surface, there were signs that this picture might be incomplete. America possessed something that no European power could match in the long run: an enormous industrial economy. In 1939, the United States produced more steel, more oil, and more automobiles than almost any other nation on Earth combined. The country had vast natural resources, huge manufacturing capacity, and a population of more than 130 million people. The problem was not potential, the problem was mobilization. None of that industrial power had been directed toward military production yet. In 1939, the American economy was still recovering from the Great Depression. Factories were operating below full capacity, millions of workers were underemployed. The machinery that would later build tanks and aircraft already existed, but it was building consumer goods instead of weapons. German leaders largely ignored this possibility. Their strategic calculations focused on immediate military strength, not long-term industrial capacity. From their perspective, wars were decided quickly by decisive campaigns. The lightning victories in Poland and later in Western Europe reinforced this belief. If Germany could defeat its enemies in months, then the slow industrial buildup of a distant power like the United States would not matter. And in the early years of the war, that assumption seemed correct. German forces overran Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France with astonishing speed. The Wehrmacht appeared to be unstoppable. Meanwhile, the United States was still debating budgets, drafting new training programs, and slowly expanding its armed forces. In fact, in 1939 and 1940, American soldiers were still practicing basic maneuvers with limited equipment. Some tank units trained using trucks marked with the word tank painted on the side because there weren't enough real armored vehicles available. It was an improvisation that looked almost absurd when compared with the massive armored columns moving across Europe. But history has a way of hiding turning points in plain sight. While Germany was celebrating its early victories, a quiet transformation had already begun inside the United States. Industrial planners, military officers, and government officials were starting to ask a different question. Not how strong the American military was at that moment, but how strong it could become if the entire economy shifted toward war. In 1939, that question still sounded theoretical. Few people imagined just how far the answer would go. German intelligence reports continued to focus on current numbers, tanks, divisions, aircraft already in service. They did not fully calculate the scale of factories that could be converted, the millions of workers who could be trained, and the speed with which American industry could reorganize itself once the political decision was made. For the moment, the image remained the same: a small army, wooden rifles, a country ranked 19th in military power. To many leaders in Berlin, the conclusion seemed obvious. The United States might be wealthy, but it was not dangerous. What they did not yet realize was that the same country training soldiers with wooden rifles also possessed the largest industrial system the world had ever seen. And once that system began to move, the numbers that had once made Germany laugh would be replaced by numbers so large that even German war planners would struggle to believe them.
At the beginning of the war, most German leaders believed the United States would remain a distant observer. Even as fighting spread across Europe in 1940, many officials in Berlin continued to treat American power as a theoretical problem rather than an immediate threat. They saw a country with a small army, limited equipment, and a political culture deeply resistant to war. From their perspective, the United States had wealth but lacked the will to transform that wealth into military strength. But inside Washington, the calculations were beginning to change. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that the outcome of the war might depend not only on armies already fighting in Europe, but on the ability of industrial nations to sustain production over many years. In late 1940, Roosevelt introduced a phrase that would define the American strategy. He called the United States the arsenal of democracy. The idea behind that phrase was simple but revolutionary. Even if the United States was not yet fully in the war, its factories could supply the weapons that other nations desperately needed. Britain, fighting almost alone after the fall of France, required aircraft, ships, and ammunition at a scale its own industry struggled to maintain. Roosevelt believed American production could fill that gap. When Roosevelt began discussing the scale of production he wanted, many people thought the numbers were unrealistic. In one speech, he proposed that American factories could produce 50,000 aircraft per year. To modern ears, that might not sound shocking, but in 1940, it seemed almost absurd. The entire U.S. aircraft industry had produced only a fraction of that number the year before. Even inside the United States government, some officials doubted it could be done. Building airplanes required specialized factories, skilled workers, and complex supply chains. Expanding production that dramatically would mean reorganizing entire industries. Yet Roosevelt believed the country's industrial base had the capacity to do it if it was properly coordinated. Across the Atlantic, German leaders heard these announcements and reacted with disbelief. Among the skeptics was Hermann Göring. Göring had built one of the largest air forces in the world and had spent years overseeing German aircraft production. When he heard American promises of massive output, he reportedly laughed. From his perspective, such numbers were propaganda meant to encourage Britain rather than realistic industrial plans. German intelligence analysts also struggled to understand how quickly the United States could scale up production. Their reports acknowledged American industrial capacity, but emphasized that converting civilian factories into military ones would take years. Germany believed it had time to defeat Britain, time to consolidate control over Europe, and time to prepare for any future confrontation. But something unusual was happening inside the American government. Instead of relying only on traditional military leadership, Roosevelt began bringing in people from industry to reorganize production. One of the most important figures in this transformation was William S. Knudsen. Knudsen was a Danish immigrant who had started his career as a bicycle mechanic. Over decades, he rose through the industrial world and eventually became one of the top executives at General Motors. By 1940, he was earning a salary of around $500,000 a year, an enormous sum at the time. Yet when Roosevelt asked him to help coordinate American war production, Knudsen accepted a symbolic salary of just $1. The decision surprised many people. Knudsen was not a general or a politician, he was a manufacturing expert. But that was exactly why Roosevelt wanted him. Knudsen understood assembly lines, supply chains, and factory logistics better than almost anyone in the country. His job was to figure out how to turn America's industrial potential into actual weapons. What Knudsen and his colleagues began doing was essentially redesigning the entire production system of the United States. Automobile factories that once built cars were studied as potential tank plants. Appliance manufacturers were examined for their ability to produce aircraft parts. Shipyards that had built commercial vessels were evaluated for mass production of naval ships. At first, the transformation moved slowly. Contracts had to be negotiated, factories needed new tools and machines, workers had to be trained for unfamiliar tasks. Many companies had never built military equipment before and had to learn from scratch.
But once the process began, something remarkable happened. The United States had an advantage that no other nation possessed at the same scale: a massive network of modern factories designed for high-volume manufacturing. Automobile companies like Ford and General Motors had already mastered assembly line production. Instead of building thousands of cars, those lines could produce eventually thousands of tanks or aircraft engines. Meanwhile, American industry still had millions of workers available. The country was only gradually emerging from the Great Depression, and unemployment remained significant in some regions. War production offered steady jobs and stable wages. As factories expanded, workers poured into industrial cities to take part in the new effort. The transformation was not just mechanical, it was cultural. Businesses that once competed fiercely with each other were now cooperating on government contracts. Engineers shared designs, manufacturers coordinated supply chains. Entire regions of the country began reorganizing their economies around wartime production. While this process accelerated, the German leadership still underestimated its speed. They continued to focus on immediate military events in Europe: campaigns in the Balkans, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and the air war over Britain. American production numbers were noted, but they were not yet treated as a decisive strategic threat. And in fairness, early results did not immediately prove Roosevelt right. In 1940 and early 1941, American production was still ramping up. Factories were expanding, but output had not yet reached the levels Roosevelt had promised. To skeptics in Germany, this seemed to confirm their belief that the United States was exaggerating its capabilities. But the real shift was already underway. Once assembly lines were redesigned and supply chains stabilized, production could accelerate with astonishing speed. Each month, factories produced more aircraft, more vehicles, and more equipment than the month before. The phrase "arsenal of democracy" began turning from a political slogan into a measurable reality. Weapons were not only equipping American forces, but also being shipped overseas to support allies fighting on multiple fronts. What made this transformation so difficult for German planners to understand was that it did not rely only on traditional military leadership. Instead of simply recruiting more soldiers, the United States was reorganizing its entire economy. Steel mills, oil refineries, railroads, trucking companies, and electrical manufacturers were all becoming part of a massive production network. From Berlin, the change was still easy to underestimate. Germany had achieved stunning victories using speed and tactical innovation. Their strategy assumed wars would be decided by battlefield operations and short campaigns. The idea that industrial output thousands of kilometers away could eventually determine the outcome of the conflict seemed abstract compared with tanks advancing across European fields. Yet by the time German leaders began to grasp what was happening, the American production system was already gaining momentum. Factories that once produced consumer goods were now producing military hardware in rapidly increasing quantities. Workers who had never built a weapon before were learning to assemble aircraft engines, machine guns, and armored vehicles. The numbers Roosevelt had promised, numbers that once sounded impossible, were slowly moving within reach. And when those numbers finally began appearing in production reports, even the skeptics who had laughed at them would be forced to admit something they had never expected. The United States was not just preparing for war, it was building the largest industrial war machine the world had ever seen.
By 1942, the transformation that had once sounded impossible was beginning to produce results that even its architects struggled to comprehend. The United States was no longer experimenting with war production. It had fully committed its entire industrial system to it. Factories that had once produced consumer goods were now operating around the clock, and the scale of output was growing month by month. One of the most remarkable examples of this transformation stood in Michigan. It was a factory so large that workers joked you could fit entire towns inside it.
This was the Willow Run bomber plant, built to produce one of the most complex machines of the war, the B-24 heavy bomber. Constructed by the Ford Motor Company, Willow Run applied the same mass production philosophy used for automobiles to aircraft manufacturing. Before the war, building a bomber was a slow and specialized process. Skilled technicians assembled planes almost like craftsmen, one piece at a time. But Ford engineers believed airplanes could be built the way cars were built, moving down a massive assembly line with standardized parts and specialized workers performing small, repeated tasks. At first, the idea seemed unrealistic. Bombers were enormous machines with thousands of components. Precision mattered, and many aviation experts believed mass production would reduce quality. Yet Ford pushed forward with the experiment. The factory floor stretched for nearly a mile. Parts arrived by rail, truck, and conveyor systems that carried components from one station to the next. As the process improved, the results became extraordinary. By 1944, the Willow Run plant was producing a fully assembled heavy bomber roughly every 63 minutes. That meant an aircraft weighing more than 18 tons, packed with engines, weapons, electronics, and structural components, was rolling off the assembly line almost every hour. For German planners, numbers like that were difficult to grasp. Aircraft factories in Europe were often dispersed, smaller, and vulnerable to bombing. They relied on skilled labor and complicated supply chains that were frequently disrupted by Allied air attacks. In contrast, American factories operated in relative safety across the Atlantic Ocean, with access to vast resources and enormous production space. Aircraft were only one part of the story. Shipbuilding was undergoing an equally dramatic revolution. Before the war, constructing large cargo ships could take many months. Each vessel required careful assembly and skilled craftsmanship. But the United States needed ships faster than traditional methods allowed. Supplies had to cross the Atlantic to reach Britain and the Soviet Union, and German submarines were sinking merchant ships at alarming rates. To solve this problem, American engineers introduced new construction techniques based on prefabrication. Instead of building ships piece by piece in a single dock, entire sections of the hull could be constructed separately and then welded together in the shipyard. This dramatically reduced construction time. One of the most famous innovators in this system was Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser had never built ships before the war. He was known primarily for construction projects, such as dams and infrastructure. Yet, when he was asked to manage shipyard production, he approached the challenge with the mindset of a builder rather than a traditional ship designer. Kaiser's shipyards began producing Liberty ships, simple but reliable cargo vessels designed specifically for rapid construction. Workers assembled large prefabricated sections and welded them together with astonishing speed. What once took months could now be completed in weeks. In November 1942, one Liberty ship became a symbol of this new industrial capability. The vessel was assembled, launched, and completed in just 4 days and 15 hours. Although that pace was a special demonstration rather than the normal schedule, it showed how dramatically production methods had evolved. Behind these achievements were millions of workers, many of whom had never imagined themselves working in heavy industry. As the war expanded, American factories faced an enormous labor shortage. Millions of men were serving in the armed forces, leaving manufacturing plants without enough workers to maintain production. The solution reshaped the American workforce. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs that had previously been considered exclusively male. They operated welding equipment, assembled aircraft parts, and managed complex industrial machinery. The cultural symbol of this transformation became Rosie the Riveter, representing the millions of women who joined the wartime workforce. Many of them had previously worked as teachers, clerks, or homemakers. Others came from small towns and rural communities where large factories had never existed before. Training programs were created to teach these new workers specialized skills. In a matter of months, individuals who had never touched industrial equipment were learning to operate precision tools and assemble complex machinery. Production lines were designed so that tasks could be mastered quickly, allowing thousands of new employees to become productive in a short time. Factories also became more diverse than ever before. African American workers moved into industrial jobs in growing numbers, particularly in northern cities where war production was concentrated. Although discrimination and segregation still existed, the demand for labor forced many companies to open positions that had previously been closed to minority workers. By 1943, the results of this mobilization were visible everywhere. American factories were producing aircraft, tanks, trucks, artillery, and ammunition at a scale unmatched in history. Assembly lines stretched across enormous plants, and railroads carried finished equipment to ports and military bases around the country. What made this system especially powerful was its ability to expand continuously. Each improvement in manufacturing methods increased efficiency. Engineers redesigned parts to simplify production, supply chains were streamlined, factories learned from their own mistakes and produced more equipment with fewer delays. For German war economy, this presented a growing strategic problem. Germany had also mobilized its industry, but it faced severe limitations. Allied bombing campaigns targeted factories, transportation networks, and oil facilities. Resources were increasingly scarce. Skilled workers were drafted into the military or killed in combat. Meanwhile, the United States was thousands of kilometers away from the front lines, protected by oceans and equipped with abundant natural resources. Steel production, oil extraction, and electricity generation all supported the expanding war industries. By the middle of the war, American production was no longer just catching up with Germany, it was surpassing it. Aircraft output surged into the tens of thousands each year. Shipyards launched fleets of cargo vessels and warships. Tank factories delivered armored vehicles in quantities that European planners had never anticipated. And the most striking aspect of this transformation was how quickly it had happened. Only a few years ago, the American Army had struggled to equip its training units. Now the country was producing weapons in numbers that could supply not only its own forces, but also the armies of its allies. To many German officials, the scale of American production felt almost unreal. Intelligence reports began describing factories capable of output far beyond previous estimates. Aircraft numbers grew faster than expected. Ships crossed the Atlantic carrying endless supplies. The industrial system that once looked slow and unprepared was now operating with relentless momentum. Assembly lines never stopped. Shipyards worked night and day. Trains carried raw materials in and finished weapons out. What Germany had once dismissed as a distant industrial nation was rapidly becoming something far more dangerous, a war machine powered by the largest manufacturing economy on the earth. And as the output of that machine continued to grow, the battlefield consequences were about to become impossible for German commanders to ignore.
By the time American industry was reaching full speed, the real test was beginning on the battlefield. Production numbers were impressive, but wars are not won in factories alone. They are decided by soldiers under fire, commanders making decisions in chaos, and armies learning how to fight. For a time, it seemed the German belief about American soldiers might actually be correct. The first major clash between American ground forces and the German army came in North Africa. In early 1943, inexperienced American troops encountered veteran German units commanded by one of the most respected generals in the Wehrmacht, Erwin Rommel. Rommel's forces had been fighting in the desert for years.
They were battle-hardened, highly disciplined, and extremely confident. The confrontation became known as the Battle of Kasserine Pass. When German armored units attacked through the mountain passes of Tunisia, they struck American positions that were poorly coordinated and commanded by officers with limited combat experience. The results were chaotic. German tanks pushed through defensive lines. Communication between American units broke down. Some formations retreated in confusion, abandoning equipment and positions. For German commanders observing the battle, it seemed like confirmation of everything they had believed about the United States Army. The Americans were inexperienced, their command structure was untested, their soldiers, in the eyes of German veterans, looked unprepared for modern mechanized warfare. Reports from the German side reflected this confidence. Some officers described American troops as brave but poorly organized. Others believed the United States Army lacked the discipline and experience necessary to face German armored forces on equal terms. For a brief moment, it appeared the early assumptions made in Berlin might actually be correct. But something else was happening at the same time, something German commanders did not fully expect. The American military system had a remarkable ability to analyze failure and adapt quickly. Instead of denying the problems revealed at Kasserine Pass, U.S. commanders studied them in detail. Ineffective leaders were replaced, training programs were intensified, communication systems were improved. One of the generals who emerged during this period was George S. Patton. Known for his aggressive leadership style, Patton believed American forces could match any army in the world if they moved faster, trained harder, and maintained strict discipline. Under his command, units that had previously struggled began reorganizing and preparing for new operations. At the same time, the enormous industrial machine back in the United States was beginning to show its true impact on the battlefield. American units were not only receiving better training, they were also receiving massive quantities of equipment. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and aircraft arrived in increasing numbers. One of the most important advantages was not a weapon at all, it was logistics. Modern armies require constant supplies of fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, and medical equipment. Without these, even the most powerful combat units cannot continue fighting. The American approach to logistics became one of the defining strengths of the Allied war effort. Supplies moved across oceans in cargo ships, across continents by rail, and finally to the front lines by truck convoys. The scale of this system was extraordinary. A famous example of this logistical power appeared later in the war in the form of the Red Ball Express. This was a massive network of truck convoys created to supply Allied armies advancing across France after the invasion of Normandy. More than 23,000 drivers operated thousands of trucks day and night, carrying fuel, ammunition, and food to rapidly moving combat units. Many of these drivers were young soldiers with little combat experience, yet their work kept entire armies moving forward. Without them, tanks would have run out of fuel, artillery would have lacked ammunition, and the advance would have slowed dramatically. For German commanders who encountered American forces later in the war, the difference was becoming clear. Early battles had shown an inexperienced army learning under pressure, but within a relatively short period of time, those same forces were fighting with increasing coordination and confidence. The combination of industrial output and logistical organization created a unique military system. American units often entered battle with abundant supplies, replacement equipment, and continuous support from aircraft and artillery. Damaged vehicles could be repaired quickly, wounded soldiers could be evacuated efficiently, fresh units and additional equipment were constantly arriving from the rear. German commanders, by contrast, were beginning to feel the strain of a long war. Fuel shortages were becoming more common, replacement tanks and vehicles were harder to obtain. Allied bombing campaigns were damaging railways, factories, and oil facilities across Europe. On the battlefield, this difference gradually became visible. Even when German units fought effectively, they often struggled to replace losses. American formations, supported by the vast industrial capacity of the United States, could recover and rearm far more quickly. By the later stages of the war, German officers who had once dismissed the United States Army were starting to change their opinions. They realized they were facing not just individual soldiers, but an entire system built on enormous economic and industrial strength. And perhaps the most surprising element for German planners was how quickly the transformation had happened. Only a few years ago, the United States had fielded a small and underprepared army. Now it was deploying millions of soldiers across multiple continents, supported by endless streams of equipment. The defeat at Kasserine Pass had once seemed like proof that Germany's early assumptions were correct. But in hindsight, it became something very different. It was the moment when the United States Army confronted its weaknesses, learned from them, and began evolving into one of the most powerful military forces of the 20th century. What Germany initially interpreted as weakness turned out to be something else entirely. The early stage of an army that was still learning and backed by an industrial machine that was only beginning to reach its full power. By 1944, the cumulative effects of American production and industrial mobilization were impossible to ignore. Germany, which had once dismissed the United States as a distant, weak power, was now facing an enemy whose strength was defined not only by soldiers in the field, but by the enormous machinery supporting them. Factories, shipyards, and assembly lines had become weapons themselves, producing quantities of tanks, aircraft, and ships that no German planner had imagined possible. Strategic bombing campaigns had begun to weaken German industry, but the sheer volume of American output meant that every loss could be replaced. Airfields were constantly supplied with new planes, depots replenished with tanks and artillery, and fleets of Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic, delivering fuel, ammunition, and food. The combination of relentless production and robust logistics created an almost unstoppable momentum for Allied forces. Inside Germany, the realization was gradual but undeniable. Albert Speer, responsible for coordinating German war production, admitted after the war that the scale of American manufacturing had been underestimated. While Germany focused on immediate military victories and tactical brilliance, it failed to account for the strategic power of industrial capacity. Even the most advanced tanks and aircraft could not compensate for a shrinking supply of fuel, raw materials, and replacement equipment. The Allies' ability to produce hundreds of thousands of aircraft, thousands of tanks, and millions of tons of supplies was unlike anything the world had seen. By the end of the war, the United States alone had produced over 300,000 planes. The factories that had once built cars, refrigerators, and household appliances were now churning out weapons at a pace that dwarfed any European effort. Shipyards launched Liberty ships in weeks instead of months, ensuring that troops and supplies could reach distant theaters of war without interruption. This industrial superiority directly translated into battlefield dominance. American and Allied forces could absorb losses and keep advancing. If one division was slowed by casualties or mechanical failures, another could take its place without halting the offensive. This flexibility contrasted sharply with the German army, which often struggled to replace losses and maintain momentum. The human dimension of this effort was equally extraordinary. Millions of workers, men, women, and even teenagers participated in the war effort, often learning technical skills on the job. Women, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, became essential in assembling aircraft and munitions. Teenagers who had never handled industrial equipment were now welding, riveting, and inspecting planes and ships. The labor force became a force multiplier, turning the American population itself into a kind of war asset. Even the German U-boat campaigns, which initially threatened to choke Allied supply lines, ultimately could not overcome the sheer scale of production. Ships sunk by submarines were quickly replaced by new vessels rolling off American docks. Every loss was temporary. Every gain for Germany was matched by an even larger replenishment from across the ocean. The German military machine, once considered the most advanced in Europe, was gradually overwhelmed by this continuous flow of equipment, fuel, and trained personnel. Hitler's generals, who had laughed at early American warnings and production estimates, found themselves fighting a war that could not be won by tactical genius alone. The scale and speed of American industrial output reshaped the strategic landscape entirely. By 1945, ideology had blinded the German leadership, and the consequences were clear. Decisions that might have delayed or mitigated defeat were ignored because planners underestimated a nation they had considered weak. While German forces fought valiantly on multiple fronts, they were increasingly outmatched not just in men, but in materiel, logistics, and sustaining capacity. Testimonies from the Nuremberg trials further illustrated this point. Many German officers admitted that they had failed to appreciate how quickly the United States could mobilize. Statements from captured industrial and military leaders highlighted a single theme. Germany's misjudgment of American potential had been catastrophic. They had ignored the evidence of industrial strength and focused too heavily on immediate battlefield victories. Ultimately, what defeated Germany was not a single battle or campaign, but the relentless power of American production combined with the Allies' strategic coordination. Factories, assembly lines, and labor forces became as decisive as tanks and planes. The nation that had once trained soldiers with wooden rifles had become a war machine capable of producing hundreds of thousands of aircraft, thousands of ships, and enough material to sustain Allied forces across multiple continents. The lesson was stark and clear. In modern war, industrial capacity can outweigh battlefield skill. Ideology and assumptions about weakness can blind even the most sophisticated military planners. Germany's underestimation of the United States allowed an initially small, unprepared army to evolve into one of the most formidable forces in history, backed by an economic and industrial engine that no other nation could match. By the end of the war, the United States had proven that production, organization, and adaptability could decisively shape outcomes. Germany had fought with courage and skill, but it had failed to account for the true scale of its enemy. The arsenal of democracy had delivered on its promise, transforming a nation once considered incapable of war into the decisive factor in defeating the most powerful military machine in Europe.